Weimar, Germany, November 1923. Walk into a bakery. A single loaf of bread sits on the counter. The price tag reads 200 billion marks. 5 years earlier, in 1918, that same amount of money, 200 billion marks, could have bought you entire city blocks in Berlin. It could have purchased factories, estates, a life of luxury for generations. If you had held that wealth in a bank account, you were considered royalty. 5 years later, it couldn't buy you the calories to survive a single day. That is the terrifying speed of a currency collapse. 5 years. That is all it took for a stable, industrialized, educated superpower to turn its currency into confetti. Most people in Germany lost everything. The middle class was wiped out. Pensioners starved. The prudent savers who trusted the system were the ones who suffered the most. But not everyone lost everything. Even in the darkest months of hyperinflation, even in the chaos of the Great Depression or the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were people who survived. There were people who even thrived. They didn't survive because they were lucky, and they didn't survive because they predicted the exact date of the crash. They survived because they understood the difference between money and wealth. They followed a set of financial principles that are as old as Rome. Right now, in 2025, the United States and the global economy are flashing the exact same warning signs that preceded every major collapse in history. Debt is vertical. Currency is being printed by the trillion. Political polarization is tearing institutions apart. The system is following a script. And if history is a guide, the time for business as usual investing is over. Whatever happens next, whether it is a slow decline like Britain, a hyperinflationary event like Weimar, or a deflationary depression like the 1930s, the rules of the game are about to change. Today, we are going to look at the 5 financial principles that have survived every collapse in recorded history. These aren't stock tips. They aren't temporary tactics. These are the iron laws of survival. The trap, tactics versus principles. Before we hand you the keys, you have to understand why most people fail. They fail because they confuse tactics with principles. A tactic is specific advice for a specific time. Buy tech stocks, flip real estate, buy long-term bonds. Tactics work when the system is stable. They rely on the assumption that the future will look like the past. They rely on courts enforcing contracts, banks remaining solvent, and money retaining its value. But in a collapse, those assumptions break. If you bought bonds in Russia in 1916, you used a safe tactic. By 1918, you had zero. If you kept cash in a savings account in Argentina in 2001, you used a safe tactic. Overnight, the government froze it and stole 2/3 of its value. A principle is different. A principle is a fundamental truth about value that works regardless of what the government does. It works in Rome, it works in Venezuela, it works in America. So, let's look at the 5 principles that save you when the system breaks. Principle 1, hard assets survive. Paper burns. The first rule is the simplest, yet the hardest for modern investors to accept. In a collapse, paper assets burn. Hard assets survive. We live in a world of paper wealth, stocks, bonds, ETFs, bank deposits, insurance policies. These are not things you own. These are claims. A stock is a claim on future earnings. A bond is a claim on future tax revenue. A bank deposit is a claim on the bank's promise to pay you back. In a crisis, claims become unenforceable. Let's go back to Weimar, Germany. The man who kept 100,000 marks in the bank lost it all. The number on the paper stayed the same, but the purchasing power evaporated. Now, compare him to his neighbor, who used those marks in 1919 to buy a small farm, or a workshop, or even a piano. When the currency collapsed, the farm was still a farm. The soil didn't care about the exchange rate. The workshop still had tools. The gold watch was still gold. When the dust settled and Germany introduced a new currency, the man with the paper had zero. The man with the farm still had a farm. His wealth was preserved because it was physical. It had intrinsic utility. We saw this again in Zimbabwe in 2008. Hyperinflation reached 79 billion% per month. If you held Zimbabwean dollars, you starved. But if you owned cattle, cattle were wealth. You could trade a cow for months of supplies. You could trade milk for medicine. The cow was a hard asset. It essentially became the new currency. Look at Argentina in 2001. The government froze bank accounts in what was called the They forcibly converted dollar savings into pesos at a fake exchange rate. Anyone holding paper money in the banking system was sheared like a sheep. But those who held physical US dollars under a mattress, they were kings. Those who owned real estate free and clear, they retained their wealth. In America today, we are conditioned to believe that a digital number on a screen is wealth. It isn't. It is a liability of a counterparty. When the system breaks, the counterparty defaults. Maybe they default by not paying you deflation, or maybe they default by paying you in worthless printed money, inflation. Either way, the paper burns. The principle is this: you must own things that exist without a counterparty. Land, gold, silver, tools, commodities. Things that are valuable because of what they are, not what someone promises they are worth. Principle 2. Own productive assets, not speculative ones. This leads us to a critical distinction. Not all hard assets are created equal. You must distinguish between speculative assets and productive assets. A speculative asset is something you buy solely because you hope someone else will pay more for it later. A productive asset is something you buy because it generates value, income, or utility. Right now, let's look at the Great Depression in the United States, 1929 to 1933. This wasn't an inflationary collapse. It was a deflationary one. Money became scarce. The stock market collapsed 89%. Speculative real estate bubbles in Florida popped, wiping people out. If you owned an asset just hoping for the price to go up, you were destroyed. There were no buyers. But consider the person who owned a productive farm, or a small rental property, or a local business that made essential goods like shoes or bread. Even though the price of the farm might have dropped 50% on paper, the farm still produced corn. It still produced eggs. The family could eat. They could trade the surplus. The asset had use value. Now look at Venezuela in the 2010s. The stock market in Caracas technically went up millions of percent in local currency, but in real terms, it was worthless. However, a bakery was a fortress. It took flour and water-hard assets and turned them into bread, a survival necessity. That is a productive asset. In 2025, American investors are addicted to speculation. We buy Bitcoin not to use it, but to sell it higher. We buy houses not to live in, but to flip. We buy stocks with P/E ratios of 50, hoping for a greater fool to buy them at 60. In a collapse, the greater fool disappears. The music stops. If you own a rental property free and clear, it provides shelter, a fundamental human need. Even if the rent drops, it produces value. If you own a garden, it produces calories. If you own energy infrastructure, it produces power. When the economy seizes up, nobody wants to buy your speculative token or your overvalued growth stock. But everybody needs food, shelter, energy, and basic services. Wealth shifts from those who trade paper to those who produce reality. Principle 3. Debt is suicide. Principle number 3 is the most dangerous one for modern Americans. In a collapse, debt creates a binary outcome. You survive or you lose everything. There is no middle ground. We are taught that debt is a tool. Good debt helps you build wealth. Leverage enhances returns. In stable times, this is true. In a collapse, debt is a death sentence. Let's go back to the American farmers of the 1920s. During World War I, crop prices were high. Farmers borrowed heavily to buy more land and new tractors. It made sense on paper. Then 1929 hit. Commodity prices collapsed. A farmer's income dropped by 60%. But the mortgage payment to the bank, it stayed exactly the same. The bank didn't care that corn was cheap. They wanted their money. Between 1930 and 1935, over 750,000 farms were foreclosed upon. Families who had worked that land for 3 generations lost it in 3 years. Now, compare them to the farmer down the road who refused to borrow. He owned 40 acres, free and clear. When prices crashed, he was poor. He didn't make a profit. He couldn't buy new clothes, but no one could kick him off his land. He had a roof. He had food. He survived the Depression because his burn rate was 0. We see this again in the housing crash of 2008, and even more brutally in Greece in 2010. In Greece, incomes fell by 40%. Pensions were slashed, but the mortgages were owed to foreign banks who demanded full payment. If you had debt, you were a slave to the crisis. If you were debt-free, you were merely an observer of the crisis. There is a dangerous myth circulating today. People say, Inflation is good for debtors. If I owe $300,000 and inflation hits, the debt becomes worthless. This is a seductive lie. It assumes your income will rise with inflation. In almost every historical collapse, wages lag behind inflation. Prices go up, but your paycheck doesn't. Or worse, the economy crashes and you lose your job entirely. So now costs are up. You have no income, and the bank is still demanding that monthly payment. In 2025, U.S. household debt is at an all-time high of $17 trillion. Auto loans, student loans, credit cards, mortgages. We are levered to the hilt. When the liquidity crisis hits, the banks will not be lenient. They will be fighting for their own survival. They will call in loans. They will foreclose. The only truly safe position in a collapse is zero debt. If you own your assets free and clear, you have staying power. You can wait out the storm. If you are leveraged, the storm breaks you. Principle 4. Skills are the only portable wealth. The first 3 principles were about things you can touch: land, gold, shelter. But what happens if the government takes them? What happens if you become a refugee? This brings us to Principle 4. Skills are the only wealth that cannot be confiscated. History is full of examples where physical wealth was seized. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, 1917, the communists seized all private property. The aristocrats, the landlords, the wealthy merchants, they were stripped naked overnight. Their bank accounts, gone. Their estates, nationalized. But look at who retained value in the Soviet system. The engineers, the doctors, the mechanics, the machinists. The state needed them. You can confiscate a factory, but you cannot confiscate the knowledge of how to run it. A skilled surgeon in Moscow was still a skilled surgeon. He had leverage. He could trade his services for better rations, for protection, for survival. The wealthy socialite with no skills had nothing to trade. We saw this in the most horrific circumstances imaginable. The Holocaust. When Jewish families were stripped of their businesses, their homes, and their dignity, physical wealth meant nothing. But in the ghettos and even in the camps, those with practical skills, tailors, carpenters, electricians, doctors often had a slightly higher chance of survival. Their utility bought them time. Fast forward to Vietnam, 1975, the fall of Saigon. Millions fled. They left behind their gold bars, their homes, their businesses. They arrived in America with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Who rebuilt the fastest? The professionals, the tradesmen, the people who had knowledge in their heads. Within a generation, Vietnamese refugees had rebuilt immense wealth in the U.S. because they brought their human capital with them. In America 2025, we have a knowledge economy that is actually a bullshit economy. We have millions of people whose job is to send emails, attend Zoom meetings, and manage spreadsheets. These are luxury beliefs jobs. They only exist in a high-trust, complex, financialized economy. If the grid goes down, or the currency collapses, or the supply chains break, what can you actually do? Can you fix a generator? Can you suture a wound? Can you grow tomatoes? Can you purify water? Can you build a shelter? In a collapse, the value of a diversity consultant or a hedge fund analyst goes to zero. The value of a diesel mechanic, a nurse, or a carpenter goes to infinity. Skills are the ultimate hedge because they are weightless, tax-free, and confiscation-proof. Principle 5. Local networks outlast institutions. The final principle is perhaps the most important because humans are not solitary creatures. Principle 5. When institutions fail, local networks create survival. We currently outsource our survival to massive, faceless institutions. We rely on Walmart for food. We rely on the police for security. We rely on the Federal Reserve for money. We rely on the government for disaster relief. We trust the system. But the definition of a collapse is that the system stops working. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, the central government simply ceased to function. The supply chains broke. There was no food in the state-run stores. The ruble was worthless. So how did 290 million people not die of starvation? They survived through blat. This was the Russian term for favors, connections, and informal networks. I have a cousin who works at the meat factory. He can get us sausage. You fix his car. My neighbor grows potatoes. I will trade my stockpiled vodka for a sack. The economy didn't stop. It just moved from the institutional level to the local level. It became a trust-based, peer-to-peer economy. Look at Argentina again. When the banks closed in 2001, neighborhoods formed assemblies, local assemblies. They organized food swaps. They organized security watches because the police were on strike or corrupt. The people who suffered the most were the isolated individuals, the people with money in the bank, but no friends on the street. In America, we are richer than the Soviets were, but we are socially poorer. We are hyper-individualized. We live in suburbs where we don't know our neighbors' names. We are terrifyingly fragile. If the trucks stop running to your local supermarket for 3 days, the shelves will be empty. If 911 stops answering, who watches your house? In a collapse, your net worth is not the number on your screen. Your net worth is the number of people who will help you when you are in trouble. A community garden is a survival asset. A neighborhood watch is a survival asset. A relationship with a local farmer is a survival asset. Building these networks takes time. You cannot buy trust when the crisis starts. You have to earn it beforehand. Conclusion: the window is closing. Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union, Weimar, Germany, Argentina, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, the dates change, the languages change, the technology changes. But the math does not change when a nation creates more debt than it can pay, when it prints more money than it has productivity, when it hollows out its industry and ignores its local communities. The collapse is inevitable. The United States has checked every single box on the list. We are not approaching the danger zone, we are living in it. The 5 principles we discussed today are your shield. Hard assets move wealth from paper claims to physical reality. Productive assets own things that generate value, not just price speculation. No debt, eliminate the leverage that allows the system to crush you. Practical skills become useful in a low-tech world. Local networks build the relationships that replace failing institutions. Applying these principles doesn't require you to know when the dollar dies. That's the beauty of it. If you get out of debt, own a productive business, and learn to fix things, your life gets better right now, even if the economy stays stable for another 10 years. But if the collapse happens tomorrow, these principles are the difference between becoming a victim and becoming a survivor. Most people watching this will nod their heads, agree, and then do nothing. They will wait for a sign. They will wait until CNN tells them it's time to panic. By then, the window will be shut. You have the information. The history books are open. The pattern is visible. The only question left is, what are you going to do about it? In the next video, we are going to move from principles to tactics. I'm going to show you specifically how to apply these 5 rules in the modern digital economy of 2025. We will talk about which hard assets make sense today, how to build a local network in an isolated society, and how to execute a debt exit strategy before interest rates trap you forever. Subscribe now. You do not want to miss that one.